Hello, Memoir and writers. I am Grant Faulkner at Memoir Nation, and I'm happy to say that Pro Writing Aid is now sponsoring this podcast. And I'm happy about that because I have used Pro Writing Aid, both as a grammar checker, but more importantly, as a tool to help me structure and probe questions in my book. And the main tool I have used is their manuscript analysis tool. It provides full manuscript developmental feedback in minutes. And to tell you the truth, I was initially dubious of it, but when I used it, it helped me uncover plot holes and think about different structural possibilities and see how my pacing worked. And I liked it because it was kind of like a beta reader because it opened up questions for me to consider. But I want to emphasize not solutions, just questions. And it made me more aware of some story elements to consider. So I essentially emerged from that analysis with a revision plan in hand. Just so you know, Pro Writing Aid's goal is not to automate storytelling. It's to make the process of writing richer and more empowering by opening up questions to consider your writing. Also, many of Pro Writing Aid's competitors support only one part of the writing process, but Pro Writing Aid has tools to help writers, from the first spark of inspiration to the polished draft. And it really is focused on creative writing, not business writing and stuff like that. So here's the dramatic ending. We have an exclusive discount for you. If you type in Memoir, all caps Memoir, to the promo code box on the purchase page, you'll get 20% off all annual subscription plans. So I encourage you to type in Memoir when you sign up for Pro Writing Aid and get 20% off, and write and revise, write and revise, write and revise. Thank you, Memoir Nation listeners.
Hello, revelers, passion finders, and niche writers. I am Brooke, here with Grant Faulkner, my much-lauded, worthy of celebration co-host. Today is a celebration episode, and it's not just for Grant, it's for both of us, for Memoir Nation, and for Right-Minded before it. Grant, can we have a drum roll, please? Beautiful. That is the noise that Grant uses in our accountability group, folks, if you ever want to come and see how it's done. But hello, this is our 400th episode. Congratulations, Grant.
Yeah, congratulations to you too. Wow.
Yeah. Wow. 400. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe. It's exciting. It does mean that we've done something like 370 plus interviews, countless hours of reading our guests' books and prepping. I'm curious if you think that or did you ever imagine when we first started that we would last this long, 8 years, almost 9, 400 episodes?
That would have been a good question for us when we first started. I think it says something about me that I didn't think too far beyond the first episode. I kind of took it episode by episode, I think, without a grand plan. But there was huge momentum, pulling me forward all the time. But I've actually recently told several people that, we've been doing this for 8 years. And when I say that, I suddenly realize we're kind of elder podcasters these days.
I like that term.
Not many podcasters have been there for 8 years. And, 400 episodes definitely astounds me. 370 interviews astounds me. I wish we could throw some big party and have all of our guests show up at once.
Oh my gosh, we could charge money for that.
Kind of like Saturday Night Live for their 50th anniversary, maybe. Yeah, but sometimes I feel like, I've gotten a type of PhD, just by sitting here and absorbing both all your wisdom and our guests' wisdom. So I've come a long way in 8 years. So.
Oh my gosh, me too. And, of course, for today, we had to cast around and, find a big and exciting guest, a big fish. And so I am very, very grateful to Ruth Reichl for being our big fish. And I did have the privilege of meeting her down in San Miguel de Allende last year when I taught there for their annual festival. She was, of course, a keynote, and she's wonderful in all the ways you imagine she would be. And when we asked her to be on the show and to be our 400th, I was particularly pleased that she was pleased to be asked to step into, that kind of invitation. She said something to the effect of, I will be your 400th. So here we are. And of course, people will be eager to get to this wonderful interview. But first, Grant, before we get there, I do want to talk briefly about what is so special about Ruth Reichl. Because for a lot of years, I knew her, and many people do, of course, as the famous food critic for the New York Times, who disguised herself when she went out to eat in restaurants restaurants. And then she left the Times and went to Gourmet for almost 10 years. And I had only read one of her books, Comfort Me with Apples, when I was still working for Seal. And I was just immersing myself in classic memoirs at the time, but I hadn't read any others. And it wasn't for lack of desire, but just so many books to read. So I'm so grateful that we had her on, because I reread Comfort Me with Apples. I read Tender at the Bone and Garlic and Sapphires. And now I'm probably just going to keep going, because she becomes a voice that you miss once the books are done. She really does. And she is such a good storyteller. Her prose is so vivid and alive and sensory. And then, of course, the way that she writes about food and what is there really to say? I mean, she is a master at it, and we're going to ask her a bit about this. But it's also nice to read books that are like relatively lighthearted. It's not to say that there's not drama and heartbreak and the stuff of life in her books, because, of course, there are ups and downs, loves and losses. But she does circle, at least in these books, her love affair with food, and it is really exquisite. And so I do want to talk about sensory writing for just a minute, because we know how critical it is, and yet it's not easy. It's not easy to find words to describe things, first of all. It's not easy to slow down enough to give space on the page, the kind of space that's really demanded for this kind of scrumptious writing, if you will. And so I'm curious your approach to sensory details, Grant. Like, do those things come easily to you, or do you find that you end up adding that kind of stuff in revision?
Yeah, I actually tend to add details of all sorts in revision. And I've always thought details in general are a weakness of mine as a writer. I'm not that detail oriented, but sensory details in particular are challenging, because like most writers, I'm just so visually oriented. And that's one reason I think our podcast and our class with Janet Fitch is so valuable, because she's just so expert in expanding one's senses on the page. And the same thing occurred to me while we were talking with Ruth today. She's thought a lot about sensory details and the way senses play into our life and our tastes in a lot of different ways. So I'm very inspired to dig deeper into this. But one of the most interesting exercises I've actually done recently around this, I've been putting on these events with Elizabeth Brosner, who we had on the podcast. And we actually got the idea after our podcast, which was about her book, The Third Ear, which was about listening. And so we started doing these sensory exercises around tasting wine, or tasting anything really. And so then people come up after these taste exercises with kind of non-wine snob words, with words that they are more naturally inclined to use. It was interesting to me to say with Ruth, she said, no one tastes the same thing the same way. So extra words really are necessary. And then all those exercises lead to like a flash fiction storytelling exercise. So we're actually doing a pie event in June. So we're going to do it with pie instead of wine. Yeah. So I'm expanding my sensory life at this late age as an elder podcaster. But in talking about Ruth and her work, though, you brought up how at the end of her audiobook for Garlic and Sapphires that she has an author Q&A in which she addresses that she didn't get all the details right, and that she disguised some restaurant names, and she'd done that to protect people, and because she didn't set out to do harm. And so I'm curious, did you appreciate that, or what did you make of that angle?
Yeah, I did appreciate it a lot. I mean, I think that memoir is so much creative work to fill in what you don't remember. And the longer that I'm in it, the more I realize how essential it is to fill in the blanks, not just for my own writing, by the way, just writers' angst over it, like this, how do I keep writing if I can't remember everything? And so this idea of writing emotional truth, writing what would have been true, to focus on emotional truth over facts. And Ruth is going to speak to this in our interview today. And especially facts that you can't retrieve, or like in Ruth's case, facts that would hurt the reputation of someone else. And so I think that memoirists honestly can't get enough permission in this regard. I see people who just get very stymied and limited, rigidity sets in, and that can just sideline the entire book, whereas if you're given permission to explore and play and storytell, then the memoir itself has breathing room. So if somebody like Ruth Reichl can role model that for writers, I do indeed think that's a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. And before we bring Ruth on, it feels important to acknowledge that part of Ruth's renown is her quest to demystify the world of fine cuisine. And, she has a very singular passion in that regard. And she's someone who knew very early on that she was interested in and meant to be in the world of food. And I know not everyone has such a strong and singular orientation to the work they do in the world, but I took something from it for myself and for other writers that once we find this thing that we know we want to do, we point ourselves towards it. And there's just an entire world to discover. And it struck me reading her that humans are so interesting in this way, the way so many of us, get fixated on something and then we want to know everything about that thing. And I feel like I was literally born into being a writer. I can't remember a time in my life when I didn't think of myself as a writer. And so we're specialists in that way and lucky if we find that thing that drives us.
Yeah, I so agree with that, Grant. And I feel lucky too. I found book publishing early on and I relate to that, Ruth's food obsession, if you will, and how I feel about the world of books. And today we're focusing on Ruth's memoirs, but she's also a novelist. And, so there's the writing part of it too, so she's probably bitten by two bugs, the food bug and the writing bug, and managed to make them both work. And I totally hear what you're saying about writing, just your entire orientation. And it's writing books, but also being book adjacent, which is cool too. And so, yeah, after we get back, we're going to talk to Ruth about a lot of different things, memoir, of course, but also her craft and her scene writing and her sensory details and her disguises and her legacy. So we're very grateful to Ruth, like I said, for saying yes to number 400, and we will be back in a flash. Welcome back, everyone. We are so excited to have Ruth Reichl with us. Ruth wrote her first cookbook in 1972. She spent the 70s as a restaurant critic for New West Magazine and the 80s as a restaurant critic and food editor at the Los Angeles Times. From 93 to 99, she was the restaurant critic for the New York Times before moving to Gourmet Magazine as editor-in-chief. Ruth is a defining voice in American food writing and journalism over the past several decades. She has written 5, I believe, or 6 by some accounts, Ruth, memoirs. Kind of hard to tell because some of them are blendy kinds of books. And then there are novels, cookbooks. You've edited a dozen books, hosted 2 television series. I think important to mention today is your wonderful newsletter on Substack, Briffe. And also, of course, not insignificantly, you're the recipient of 7 James Beard Awards. So welcome, Ruth Reichl.
I am very happy to be here.
We are so happy to have you. So, like I said, depending on how you define memoir, you've written 5 or 6 of them. So could we start here for this audience of listeners who are memoir writers or lovers of memoirs themselves, and tell us what drew you back to the well of this genre for that many books?
Well, for the first one, I didn't really intend to write a memoir. I became the restaurant critic of the New York Times, and after certainly the first year, I started getting calls from editors saying, you must be writing a book. And if you are, I'd like to see it. Well, I wasn't writing a book. I didn't have an agent. But, after the 7th or 8th phone call, I came home and said to my husband, I must be writing a book. What do you think I should write? And he said, well, you're always telling these great food stories about the people who taught you to cook. So why don't you write these shorts, just write a series of short stories about, all the important food people in your life. So I did that. And when I turned it in, Ann Godoff, who was my editor at Random House, said, each of these stories is wonderful, but you need to make the book as wonderful as the stories. You need a through line. And I realized that the only through line was really me. And so it sort of became an inadvertent memoir. And that was Tender at the Bone, Growing Up at the Table. And I mean, the interesting thing about that book was I wrote that book it was published in 1998. And bookstores didn't know what to do with it. I mean, there was no genre called the food memoir at that point. And so I would go in and ask in, biographies, do you have this book? And people would say, no, it's got recipes in it. Go upstairs to cookbooks. And I would go upstairs to cookbooks and say, do you have Tender at the Bone? And they would say, no, it's only got 10 recipes in it. It's not a cookbook. So it had a very rocky beginning because the moral of that story is don't be the beginning of a genre because your book will suffer for it.
Well, Ruth, that's so interesting. And I know that your mother is such a great character across your books, and you write her so well. And this is a question about how you conjured her up when you wrote about her after she was gone. And so I'm curious, what are some exercises or tips you have for bringing someone alive on the page the way you do, and your mother in all of her eccentricity and specificity? She's a wonderful character.
Well, I was very lucky. I mean, I don't know that I was lucky to have her as a mother, but as a writer, I was very lucky to have her because she was really a unique character. And I mean, it's interesting that you bring her up because I had a real problem with her when I wrote. I mean, the first story in Tender at the Bone is called The Queen of Mold. And it's about my mother and how she habitually poisoned people. And I mean, that's the literal truth. I mean, my mother was, as I said, she was completely unafraid of rot. And the earliest memory I have of my mother is her going through the refrigerator, scraping the blue stuff off the top and saying a little mold never hurt anyone. So if you have a character like my mother, I mean, she is a piece of cake. I mean, you just tell the stories. The problem I had with her was when I turned the first draft of the book in, Anne said to me, there's a secret hiding in this book, and I don't know what it is, but your mother character isn't working. And I said, well, I've tried very hard to make her into a sort of halcyon Auntie Mame character because I don't want to talk about her mental illness. And my mother she was like, the most bipolar person that ever walked the earth. I mean, and Anne said, well, you either have to leave her out or you have to tell the truth about her. But it is not working that you're not talking about the fact that she was not normal. I mean, you can't try and normalize her. And I would not have done this if my mother had still been alive, but she wasn't. And so I just took a deep breath and said, all right, she was bipolar and I'm going to talk about that. But what I felt like when I finished that book, I felt like I really needed to write my mother's book, that I needed to make it up for her. So, it took me a long time to do it, but I eventually wrote the book that Not Becoming My Mother, which was basically going through my mother's letters and diaries and writing about what it was like to be a mentally ill person in the 50s and 60s, a mentally ill woman in the 50s and 60s. And, I really felt like I owed that to her. I mean, I had used her and made her this character that everybody loves in my books, but she really suffered. And so I ultimately did write her book.
So, Ruth, in Comfort Me with Apples, you talk about getting assigned to do a piece by Ms. Magazine on MFK Fisher, who was your absolute hero, but you loved her because of her food writing. And Ms. wanted you to do a piece about her as, I guess, just an iconic woman. And I was curious what that experience was like for you to interview and write about the person who made you a food writer, and what stays with you about her all these many years later.
It's so funny because I'm now older than she was when I first went to interview her. And this has happened to me since then. I mean, I was such a worshiper of Mary Frances. I mean, I was embarrassed to call her up. So I actually wrote her a letter and said, Ms. Magazine has assigned me this story. Can I come interview you? And I showed up with a list of questions about books she'd written 50 years earlier. And, she would say to me, I don't remember that. And the really wonderful thing about our relationship, she had been very famous. And I was interviewing her in the 70s, and her fame had sort of dropped away. And so she was really happy to have someone who was so worshipful, so knowledgeable about her. And she really felt like a kindred spirit to me. And we became really close. And I probably interviewed her more than almost anyone else. I did that first interview with her, and then I probably did the last interview with her. I did an interview when she was really dying, and I went up to her house and spent 3 days, and there was a nurse there, and she had no voice left at that point. So I had to put my ear down to her mouth, essentially. And I would ask her questions. And then after about an hour, the nurse would come in and say, she's really tired now. And then I would go and wander around her house until the nurse said I could come back. And, the great thing about that was I finally got to ask her all the things that I had been embarrassed to ask her before, because I knew I was never going to have another chance. And it's wonderful being able to interview someone over the course of 20 years and sort of see the difference between what it's like to interview someone the first time when you only know them on paper. And, then later when you've actually spent time with them. And I am not someone who likes asking questions that I don't think are my business. But when you do what you know is going to be the last interview, you sort of get over that and ask all the rude questions that you never wanted to ask before.
I'm about to visit my mother tomorrow, so I'm going to take that as advice.
Please
for me to dig in.
Please do. You know what? I just had my first grandchild was born 3 weeks ago. And right before she was born, I spent the last week before she was born making a little book of ancestors for her, which is something that I wished I had had, with everything I could remember, all the photographs I had of my parents, my grandparents. I interviewed my husband about his family, because, there's so many things I wish I had asked that I haven't asked. And I just put down everything she might one day want to know.
Love that. Well, I'm going to go back to food writing, Ruth. And, I've read that food writing by its very nature must embody 3 of the 5 senses to be good writing. And one is not sight or visual writing, which is what most writers are drawn to. And so you have to know smell and taste and touch. And I'm one who's deficient in all of those 3 sensory details in terms of capturing the words for them. So I'm curious, how you write about food, how that might help any memoirist write with more sensory details. And how do you reach for the right words and the right metaphors? And I guess in particular, I'm just thinking taste is the toughest of those 3s to capture.
Taste is really tough for 2 reasons. One, because in English, we do not have a very good vocabulary of taste. And secondly, because we have no idea whether what we taste is what anybody else is tasting. And there is absolutely no way to know that. It is, you pretty much know when someone's looking at a movie, they're probably seeing the same movie you're seeing. We have no idea if you and I are, each eating the same plate of food, if our experience is similar in any way. And so I have always reached for all the senses to describe taste. How does it make you feel? What are you imagining visually as you're swallowing this? How can you make someone experience what you're experiencing without describing flavor? So I think it's a great exercise for any writer. When I teach food writing, I mean, one of the things I do is just take a sprig of parsley and say as the first exercise to the students, imagine that you're describing parsley to someone who has never tasted it. And how are you going to make them taste it? And you invariably come down to touch, to color, to childhood memories, and of course, aroma. I mean, taste is really mostly aroma. If you completely, and I've done this, I did this on the radio once with Chef Daniel Boulou, where we put clothespins on our noses. You cannot take, and then we started eating jelly beans, closed our eyes until we couldn't see the colors. We had no idea. You couldn't tell the difference between cherry and licorice. I mean, aroma is such an important part of flavor. And it's also, aroma is really the only sense that you experience directly inside your brain. Everything else is mitigated through your nerves. But aroma it's the most basic of all the senses. So it's incredibly important to deal with aroma when you're doing food writing.
Yeah, I love that. And people should just read your work. You're such a good example. It's delightful, really. So thank you for explaining all of that. And I want to ask you about your Substack. I mentioned La Briffe. You've been doing it for a few years. And I think you're creating something really important there because you're archiving your own articles. You often post old menus, photos, some speeches that you've written and delivered. And so it's kind of astounding to go in there and shuffle around because it captures so much history and also an experience. I was thinking of print that feels lost to us in a lot of ways, but which was really central to your career and how you came up in print media. So I'm curious what your impression is of Substack and if you're trying to use it as a home to capture your own history.
I mean, so many of the magazines I wrote for have not been digitized. So I mean, New West, which was my home for the first 7 or 8 years of my career. I mean, if I don't put those articles up, they're gone forever. And I have lived this amazing experience where I basically, I've been writing for 55 years now, maybe a little bit more. And the American food revolution has happened. I've had a front row seat at this extraordinary change that has taken place in American food. And I feel like it's important. It's a little piece of history that I have that very few other people have. So, I mean, that's my purpose really in putting it up, is just to say, here, do you want to know, for instance, the history of Japanese food in America? Something I've written about a lot, and here, I mean, this is useful to people. I mean, I think part of where this comes from, my father was a book designer. He designed, among other things, the American edition of Ulysses, and he had a very long career. I mean, he came to America in 1926 when he was 26 and worked until he died in 1980. And at the end of his life, he had every book the thousands and thousands of books he'd designed. And he went through them and put a little card into every book that he thought would be interesting to people who were interested in design. So, wow. He did Gertrude Stein's Portraits and Prayers. And it was the first time offset photography was used on a book cover. Not a jacket, but on the book binding itself. And he talks about that, and he talks about what Gertrude Stein thought about it. I mean, he just put anything that he thought would be useful to students of design down the road. And that's kind of, what I'm trying to make this stuff available to people.
The quality of the scans is amazing. So it makes so much sense. And I knew that your dad was a book designer from having read your books, but going through it, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is It's really incredible. It is. I just wanted to say that to you because I was spending time, but in researching and really looking at them one after the other, it felt kind of like going through the microfiche.
Well, there's that. But then I also put up like all kinds of new stuff and meals I've eaten and products I like. And, for me, how Substack works, and this also might be useful to your audience, it's my guilty pleasure. It's like I'm supposed to be, I've got 3 projects I'm working on that are real projects. But when I want to take a break, I go and, it's like what a friend of mine used to call free reading. When you're just doing it for the sheer fun of it. That's what my Substack is for me. It's just, I'm not working on my novel today. I'm going to go do this little guilty pleasure here.
I love that you pointed that out, Ruth, because my guilty pleasure of Substack has actually taken over all my writing. It's like it became my central writing occupation not by design, though. Well, I want to talk to you about a little bit about the craft of writing and getting into your scene writing, because you're so good at it, and your memoirs just sing with the scenes you portray. And because the scenes immerse readers in the experience. But you've also disclosed that, you take liberties, if liberties is the right word, in the sense that you do composites and you disguise people and places for reasons of privacy. And, you've mentioned that to not getting every detail and conversation right. And so it's kind of the ultimate question for memoirists, is that tension between truth and memory. So I was wondering if you could, talk a little bit about that to help people grapple with it.
Well, it's interesting. When I wrote Tender at the Bone, my first memoir, I said to Anne, my editor, I'm embroidering sometimes. And so this is like 1997, before all the scandals of the made up memoirs and stuff. And she said, oh, nobody thinks that when you're writing about your childhood, you actually remember verbatim the conversations. Don't even think about it. Nobody would say that today. But as I said in the introduction to that book, for me, it's all about the story. Nothing takes precedence over a good story. And I am addicted to fiction. I love fiction. And, it's fiction is kind of my drug of choice. And I wanted to make my memoirs read like fiction. And that means kind of leaving out the dull stuff. I don't have this need to say, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened. It's like, one of the great things about memoir, it's not biography. It's everybody understands that there's a difference between biography and memoir. And memoir is really, you're choosing to shape your story. And I think as long as you're upfront about the fact that you've done this, that you've picked and chosen, and that you've sometimes taken 2 stories and put them together. And as I said in the introduction to Tender at the Bone, not all of this is factual, but all of it is true. And what you're looking for is the truth, your truth. And honestly, when you're writing from such a distance, we all know that 3 people will have been at the same place, and nobody, in the most honest way, they will all remember it differently. We all live in a kind of Rashomon world. And I think you have to accept that. But I also think when you're writing memoir, it is really important not to take liberties with other people's lives. And you have to make your own rules. One of my rules is I think your parents, and as a parent, I can say this, your parents are fair game. Your children are not. I'm very careful about what I write about my son. And I'm very careful with what I write about other people. If I worry that I have taken a liberty and told a truth that wasn't mine to tell, I will send them that part of the book. For instance, in, I think, Comfort, I talk about Marion Cunningham and the fact that she was an alcoholic. And I sent her that chapter and said, is this okay with you? And I mean, I think you really have to do that when you're saying things that might be hurtful to people. Just as if my mother had been alive, I would certainly have sent her the manic depressive parts of Tender at the Bone and said, if you don't want me to say this, I won't. But of course, dead people are
the third game.
And I don't think you write memoir to settle scores. You can't. I mean, that is, it's just mean.
Well, in closing, Ruth, this is a two-part question. And first, I've been wanting to ask you, are you an oxyjuice-leptic?
A who?
I got this from your Substack. The word is, I believe, oxyjuice-leptic, someone who has extreme sensitivity of taste.
I am
and
so
I wanted
not.
to use it in a sentence.
and as you can see, not only am I not an oxygen blah, 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 but I can't even pronounce it. But no, I used to hope that I was a super taster and I had my tested for it, and I'm definitely not.
You're not a super. I'm surprised, actually. I would imagine that that it would be a prerequisite of the kind of work.
It's about imagination. It's not about it's not about physical ability.
Okay.
I love
Super
that.
taster. We'll leave it at that. So the second part is, I just have to ask you, of course, about your costumes, because I think that might be, for people who haven't read you, what you were known for at the time that you were the critic for the New York Times, and you would disguise yourself. And so, of course, Garlic and Sapphires, your memoir, is about that time. And honestly, it's one of the funniest books I've read in a long time. And I wanted to ask you about humor and what role humor plays in your personal writing, and whether you think a person can set out to be funny, or if it just, you kind of have to be funny on the page.
Well, I have to tell you, I mean, one of the first interviews I did after my first book came out was, when did you know that you were funny? And I said, I'm not funny. I don't think of myself as funny at all. I feel like I'm, sort of drearily earnest, but I have learned that I am funny.
Yes. Garlic and Sapphires is, I laughed out loud at multiple points. And so if people are looking for a respite from all of this chaos in the world, they can go read that book, and it's delightful.
Well, thank you. And, I love humor more than anything. So it was like really delightful to be told that I was funny, because I've just never thought I was. I don't think you can try and be funny. I think it's just, and my guess is that often funny people don't know that they're funny.
Well, that tracks. There you go. Oh, Ruth, thank you again for being number 400. We appreciate you saying yes.
Well, thank you. This has been very fun for me. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And I'm going to go do that clothespin on the nose test.
You will be amazed.
Maybe at my next dinner party. Yeah.
You'll also lose weight. Instead of Ozempic, we can all just clothespins our nose.
There you go.
We'll be right back with today's book trend. Well, Grant, since it's our 400th episode, I am going to take the opportunity to tout the other thing besides Memoir and besides Memoir Nation that I'm passionate about, and that is book publishing, and specifically hybrid book publishing. And I wrote a Substack about a month ago now about how hybrid has finally arrived to the mainstream. And I don't say that lightly, because hybrid has been around for a long time, and it's certainly had a lot of wins, but it's also an uphill battle always, because it's an author-invested publishing model, and that just on its very own can be fraught with feelings about money and people's thoughts about what it means to pay to publish, and 1,000 other things that I've had to confront over the years as a champion of this model. But like I said, it's arrived as far as I can see.
Yeah, well, I'm glad it's arrived. And I read the piece, and I remember that you led off by talking about the fact that a traditional publisher had reached out to you wanting to start a hybrid arm of their business, which I found very interesting. And that the conversation you had over lunch was about how much publishing is struggling, and that hybrid, of course, becomes a viable model for some publishers to be able to, to keep publishing. And that was just so interesting to me. So I was wondering if you can speak more about that as a trend.
Yeah, 100%. It is interesting. It is, perhaps a way that some publishers are going to keep themselves viable. I guess I wouldn't have said that it was a trend if I had just had that one lunch. But since that one lunch, two other publishers, both indies, have reached out to me. And they've said essentially the same thing, that they want to start a hybrid arm of their existing companies, or they're trying to find a way. And each of these three publishers are 40 or 50 years old, interesting, legacy publishers. Like I said, indies, so small. They're not the big five, obviously. And it's easy to look at this conversation, as like a move into hybrid in very stark terms. Like, publishers are just looking to offload risk. And yes, that is a piece of it, of course. But in every single one of these conversations, what also came up was that these publishers wanted to publish books that they believed in, but they couldn't justify the expense or the risk anymore. And so what's happening is, like, even very good books, very worthy books, books that should be published, are not earning out their expenses for publishers. And so what's happening is, these people at the helm, are taking a hard look at their finances, and they're saying, no, we can't publish that even if they want to. And I know that these indies want to take publishing risk, but you obviously have to be very risk averse if you're going to try to hit the numbers required when you are working with these traditional publishing P&Ls. And that is very limiting. And I know, I felt that way when I was at Seal Press, like limited and frustrated by all of the good books I had to say no to. And that was exactly what birthed the idea of She Writes Press in the first place. So, we'll see what happens over these next, not even, I was going to say 10 years, but I would say like 2 years, because truly I think we're in an inflection point.
Yeah, I can feel it from just the little winds of rumors and commentary that I've heard from the publishing connections I have. And so I'm curious about that inflection point and what's causing it and putting so much pressure on it. And is that consolidation, or books not selling, or publishers going out of the business, or maybe all of the above?
Yeah, I do think it's something of all of the above. There are so many books in the world. Obviously, the numbers are growing because of AI, which is frustrating. I also think people are not reading as much, or certainly not as many books. So it's very difficult to sell a lot of copies. So you can sell books, but not in the kind of volume that some of these publishers are used to. Big publishers and even big indies have always thrived on knowing that they could hit their numbers. Like, that's what the P&L is, profit and loss statements, and they're just not doing it. And then the publisher that I had lunch with, the first one, they articulated that the competition was coming not from other publishers or books, but from podcasts, online courses, and even from Substack. And so they were saying to me, look, people are getting their content, because they're a nonfiction publisher, right? So they were saying, like, people are really getting their content from all these places that are not books. And I relate to that. I think you do too, Grant. Like, I know that I'm reading fewer books than I used to. And I read a lot of Substacks. I'm an avid audiobook listener, but I probably spend more hours listening to podcasts than I do listening to audiobooks. Mm-hmm. And so we are in an existential crisis in book publishing, because like never before has there just been all these different ways that people not only get content, but also just that there's so much of it.
Yeah, like you say, I feel that for sure. And just you listing all those ways that people are getting content, I was like, yes, I'm listening to way more podcasts than I read books. And that's, it's good and bad. I would like to make more time for reading, of course. And so I'll just ask you a personal question on this subject, because it also occurred to me. Does this trend of the mainstreaming of hybrid publishing, does it make you happy? Does it put pressure on you?
That's a good question. I think it makes me happy because it legitimizes the model. And that's basically what my entire fight has been for 15 years. I don't need legacy publishers to get into this space to give hybrid a stamp of approval. But I do think that it shows in a broader way the ways in which hybrid makes sense, that there are ways of doing shared costs and profit sharing and partnership publishing that authors actually really want and even prefer, because in these models, for people who don't know, you get a higher percent of the back-end royalties. And so for the right publishers, the right authors, they actually do end up making better money and usually retaining their rights. So for people who are just like hard no on hybrid, I think they're not really looking into the details of what hybrid publishing actually is. And so, yeah, I just think it further destigmatizes the notion that paying to publish is problematic. And I've said this for years, but we do not see that same stigma or expectation in film or in the music industry. You know, like if a filmmaker finances their own film or a music artist finances their own music, that's completely aligned with being an independent artist. And so publishing has been a creative holdout on that front. I do understand sort of the reasons why, but I do think it also needs to change because it's not actually really helpful to the industry to have these different factions. and so I find it's ultimately good for hybrid published authors.
I love the way you put that, these different factions. And they do feel like different factions to somebody who's not working within one. But I really am happy that this is good news for hybrid publishing. And the more that I've learned about it, the more I see it as a pathway for these books that wouldn't ordinarily get published to be published, you know, and that's what we want. So I want to thank you for all your efforts on the hybrid publishing front and also here on our Memoir Nation home front, you know. Let's do one more round of congratulations for our 400 episodes.
Woo-hoo!
Yeah, should I ring? I'll ring my bell a couple more times.
Ring the bell if you haven't.
Oops, that's a little loud.
Sounds like church bells.
Yeah, like a little church bell, but it's been super fun, a tremendous learning experience. And kudos to you. So I'm super happy to be on this journey with you. But one of your major accomplishments is switching me over to writing a memoir.
Oh my gosh, that's good to hear. I mean, you've said that before, but yay, us. We're both in the trenches together now. But yeah, Grant, I mean, I could not have asked for a better partner in this work. And it is amazing that we've had 400 conversations over these many years and we're going so strong. And I appreciate so much everything you bring to this endeavor. So thank you back. And I would say here's to the next 400, but let's modify that to here's to the next 100. Let's get to 500 and see how we're coming along.
Yeah, I think 100 at a time. We'll keep celebrating those century marks. I can commit to that, absolutely. And listeners, May is also our anniversary of the Memoir Nation, the community, the organization, because we're more than just a podcast. The podcast grew into this organization. So if you haven't yet dropped into our community, please do. You can connect with other memoirists, share thoughts and ideas, come to a public event, or join us at the membership level for classes and our accountability group and more. It's all super exciting. So stop by memoirnation.com. We'll be there for you.